Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning into this talk. Today, we're going to be talking about how can endangered language collections be made more discoverable. And this work is done by a team at Yale in the Chirla Lab, including these people here, Irene Yee, myself, Amelia Lake, Cassandra Hockman, Sunny Ananthanarayan, Corley Cram, and Claire Bourne, who will also be presenting later on in this talk. So a little bit of background. So it's well known that endangered language collections are pretty scattered across the internet. Languages are spread across archives in often not a very systematic way. And this is a real barrier to communities and to linguists who want to find and access these materials. And some of the current solutions to this problem are to introduce regional archives like ILA or Corsail, where related languages can be found in the same place. Also, there's the OLAC archive repository to find archival deposits in multiple locations, all sort of presented on the same site. And there's also local outreach. And there's been a lot of work about this, but more can be done. So that's what we'll be talking a bit about today. So our aims and our roadmap for this talk will be, first, I'll be highlighting the existing praxis in terms of archive discoverability. And then I'll hand it over to Claire, who will suggest some further ways to achieve visibility, focusing on actions for archives and archivists, depositors, and universities, including faculty and students. So some of the existing praxis. So Sullivan 2020 talks about finder guides where, and this is a quote, users could more easily evaluate, navigate, and use such a collection if it contained a guide that contextualized it, summarized its contents, and helped users identify and locate items within it. So here we have this example where there's references to archival deposits in ILA and where you can find them, including the links. And so this is a really great way of displaying information and where to find things across multiple archival deposits. Another option is to have a web page or other site that presents materials for a language from a range of sources. Web pages, we recognize are not actually archives, but archives can be hard to navigate. See some of this group's previous work on this matter and the issues with finding things in archives, especially for sort of non-technical users. For example, we have here a screenshot from Teacher, which is a text explorer for a corpus of Colonial Valley Zapotec, created to make text accessible for community members and the general public. So yes, this isn't really the archive. It's not necessarily aimed at preserving the materials itself, but it can sort of point you in the right direction and tell you where things are and organize things a bit. And another option is to use different types of media. So for example, we have Galilei Lukana from Toby Adams. This is the Galilei language reclamation on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. They run a word of the week, weekly Galilei grammar blog posts, as well as podcasts on Spotify. So this is a great way to get the word out about an endangered language and about resources, and to be able to point people towards where to go for more information. And something else that works pretty well is telling others about projects. So for example, Chu et al. 2020 talks about storytelling as reclamation praxis. Presenting about archival materials and collections at regional conferences and workshops gets the word out to the community of people who attend those conferences. Community workshops are great to get the word out amongst community members. Papers that are sort of the type history of research on X can be helpful in sort of consolidating past work and things like that, and linking resources to Wikipedia pages. So this will often be the first place that someone will look when they're trying to find resources about a language. And so if that's available on the Wikipedia page, then it, saves people a lot of time. Okay, so now we'll move on to further suggestions. So I'll hand it over to Claire.
Well, thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to be talking about some additional things that different audiences can do to help with making collections more discoverable and findable, particularly for language communities. One option, of course, is OLAC, the Open Language Archive community, where this is a collection across different archives and different sites to bring together these materials on the at the level of individual languages. So of course, first recommendation is to have, for archives, to make sure that their collections are indexed in OLAC if they are not already. We know this can be at least a pretty substantial amount of effort. For instance, they need to be tied to particular standard language codes. The OLAC metadata format, XML format, needs to be connected to the to what OLAC can read. But these are things to be planned for, not necessarily to do immediately. Other things that archives can do is include providing features on the website to search for collections by language and location. The California Language Archives does this already, for example, makes it easy for visitors to that collection to figure out what is in that collection. And archives have a role as well in outreach, so in promoting collections to communities and regional groups that their materials may be relevant to. And I know that this audience has archivists as part of the members. Depositors also have a very strong role to play here. So for depositors, document your work. We talk a lot about metadata in language documentation, in archiving, and so on for preservation of materials, but metadata is absolutely crucial for archiving and dissemination as well. So we talked about the collection descriptions and finder guides, such as Sullivan has talked about, but that sort of documentation and making that documentation accessible is crucial for all of this work. So making sure that the communities that you work with have access to finder guides, to the metadata aggregations for the collections that you make. You can also facilitate information about where other materials are, not necessarily the materials that you have collected yourself, but materials that you know from other sources as well, such as adding links to major collections to Wikipedia pages, or writing about language snapshots, for instance, an article for language documentation and description, their language snapshots section. Thorough and consistent metadata will also help in findability and searchability. Okay, for those who work in universities, linguistics departments and university libraries also have a big role to play in the dissemination of information. So for example, are there uncatalogued materials in your department, in say the department archives, or in the results of field methods classes, or in dissertations? In the Yale fieldwork room, for instance, where we hold our meetings about fieldwork and historical linguistics and things like that, we have a large collection of, or a large box of reel-to-reel cassettes that were part of a recording project from a previous faculty member from many years ago that we're in the process of archiving and returning to communities. So that's one potential area of both materials and materials that can be made more accessible and disseminatable. Secondly, working with your university archive is a good idea. So what language materials are in the university's archive or libraries? Members of the university usually have a much better idea about how to navigate that library collection and catalogue and the places that manuscripts are, whether they're in the main collection or whether they're in a separate collection and so on. And so university members have crucial knowledge about how to find materials at their own institution, which they can do a part to make more available to those who need access to those materials as well. So these could include manuscripts, PhD theses, rare books, and so on. Think about how the university archive materials are findable. So what catalogues do you need to look in? What information does the collections have? Do their finder guides have references to individual names, but do those names include the Indigenous language consultants, for example? Libraries can look within their own campus collections as well and let community members know of materials that exist that might be relevant to them, particularly for universities and institutions that already have existing relationships with communities, for instance, in their region or because of the collections that they hold. And finally, of course, institutions can do their own outreach. This particular model relies on individuals, but institutions themselves can publicize what they have and let relevant communities know. And individuals at those universities can play a role in encouraging their institutions to do this as well, and thinking of this as an important part of public scholarship and public service as part of the university's role. So in conclusion, let's go back to a paper that is still extremely current, even though it's 20 years or so old now, almost 20 years old. Bird and Simons 2003 in Language talks about many aspects of archiving, portability, language documentation, collections, and so on. And they say that an archival format is useless unless there are tools for creating, managing, and browsing the content stored in that format. And this is very much the thread of the work we're presenting here and the encouragement that we'd like to give to those working in language documentation and archiving to explicitly consider how findable materials are and how to disseminate them, maybe at a very specific and maybe local level. Now, Bird and Simons 2003 put all their eggs in the OLAC basket. This paper is very concerned with highlighting the features of OLAC and the utility that OLAC can be used for these sorts of language materials. But I think OLAC is not the only answer here, or this group thinks that OLAC is not the only answer partly because of the way OLAC has evolved, partly because of the necessity for individual and local solutions for many of these problems. We also want to close with just mentioning that we may want to consider the extent to which materials should be discoverable. There are certainly arguments that individual collections should not be made to be publicized in the same way that other collections. But on the whole, making communities aware of materials that they then have access to is an important goal for language documentation, and indeed one of the purposes of language documentation. So with that, thank you very much for listening to this talk. We have some of the references here and we're looking forward to your questions.